Hi everybody, welcome. Thank you for joining us for this afternoon's panel, Eyewitness Now, New Ways of Seeing the News. My name is Michael Richardson. I'm an Associate Professor of Media and Culture at UNSW and an Associate Investigator with the ADM+S Centre. As we've done throughout this symposium, I want to acknowledge that we're meeting on unceded and sovereign Gadigal lands and pay my respects to elders past and present, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. New technologies are transforming the way we see news and, as a result, how we individually and collectively witness distant events. From drones to smartphones to generative AI, we now witness the world through technological eyes. And what we see circulates on platforms driven by automated media systems. Russia's war against Ukraine exemplifies these new complexities as footage from drones and weapons systems circulates alongside smartphone footage and traditional photojournalism. But while we have more ways of witnessing the world, we're also confronted with new challenges of verification, interpretation, and trust. Newsrooms, and especially photojournalists and picture editors and so on, are immediately impacted by this. But it also points to the need for new literacies for the public and for policymakers. Now, since the birth of modern media, we've always witnessed distant events through technologies of the day. So whether that's newspapers, photography, television, satellites, or smartphones. For many scholars, for example, the events of September 11, 2001 are an iconic example of this kind of media witnessing as people around the world watched this event in real time and then in endless replay as planes crashed into the towers. Through the media, a generalised understanding of the event became possible, even if that remained contested in certain spaces. With the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we're now seeing a new prevalence of imagery from drones and other automated technologies, as well as the familiar intensities and uncertainties of smartphone video. Now, witnessing serves an important social function. Witnessing is how we become responsible to an event. It's how we decide the significance and meaning, even the truth of what happened. But it's also how we develop a collective knowledge, and it's crucial to contesting and debating what matters to our communities and polities. Witnessing has always been a fraught task. When we watch smartphone footage of police violence, for example, the line between witness and spectator can be difficult to define. Now, of course, we're faced with new questions. What impact do automated systems of distribution and circulation, such as social media, play? How do they allow distant publics to participate in war, for example? How should platforms themselves deal with disinformation, misinformation, and manipulation of the visual field? And what does all this new media terrain mean for media practitioners, and especially photojournalists? So to help answer these questions and probably raise a whole bunch more, I'm joined by Olga Boichak, Nick Moir, and Tim Graham. So I'll start with Nick on the end there. Nick is the chief photographer at the Sydney Morning Herald, and he's renowned for his prize-winning photos of fire, floods, and other disasters, as well as his work covering conflicts. Dr. Olga Boichak is a lecturer in digital culture here at University of Sydney. She's a Ukrainian-born media sociologist with particular expertise in activism, conflict, and war. And Dr. Tim Graham is Associate Professor in Digital Media at the Queensland University of Technology and also an Associate Investigator in the ADM+S Centre. And Tim's work combines social theory with computational methods, and he's been studying disinformation and its various other permutations for many years now. And all three have a real interest in the ongoing war in Ukraine, and that will serve as one of the central threads of our conversation today. So, rather than a series of presentations, we're going to kind of have a bit of a structured conversation. We'll aim to leave as much time as we can for you all to join in that. We are going to show a little bit of imagery that might be arresting or disturbing for people. So yeah, just be warned in that respect. And with that, I'm going to sit down and join the rest of my fellow panelists and pass over to Nick. So, Nick, we've got one of your photos up now of a kangaroo trapped in mud as it searches for the last drops of water in the Darling River system. So let's start with what's happening on the ground for you and in the air, and what are you seeing changing? So
this image was taken using a drone back in, I think it was 2019. I don't even remember. I think it was pre the actual COVID. I actually can't remember. But anyway, essentially I was sent out to Menindee to do a story on there'd been a huge fish die-off out there. We got out there, the fishes had flooded the bottom. So Journo was starting to do the story, so I thought, well, the actual lake system is dry as a bone, so I'll go out and have a look at what's going on. I went out there and decided to put a drone up over the last sort of channels of moisture in this lake and started seeing these funny patterns. And came across, there was literally hundreds of animals stuck. You can actually see off into the distance, there's lots of little lines up there. Now, this picture is actually a symbolic picture rather than, there's only one animal you can actually see in there, though there's one up in there. So it was supposed to be symbolic of what was happening in the Darling River. However, there was quite a bit of battle on social media. One was, why didn't you save the kangaroo? It's like, well, because I couldn't hang on to the friggin' drone and lift it out. It was about 2 kilometres into the interior. So a lot of people didn't actually read the caption explaining why I didn't save the kangaroo. In fact, we called in rescuers and they had to euthanize about 50 of them via rifle. But also, as a lot of farmers also correctly pointed out on the story as well, this happens every day of the week in the bush. Yes, it is a symbolic image rather than what you would call a historical news image that you can identify as being, really useful, having a lot of information in there. You can go out to Western New South Wales now and probably find this picture. So anyway, drones have become a huge tool. The very idea of being able to get a camera, 2 kilometres away in airspace that, over areas that, you don't actually own the airspace above a particular bit of land. So for us, it's a very useful tool, and we're able to, kind of stay within the law sometimes-ish. They also, can be a real pain in the bum, and the rules around using them are very tight. In fact, for us, I have to have a license, and the public have got more freedom to use them than we do in a lot of ways. So anyway, that's kind of like the history of that one. Yeah, whenever it was, we're kind of going back there again. Anyway, yeah, they're an increasingly used tool, especially now they're becoming quite small. In fact, I just had a friend asking, should I get the sub 250 gram drone because it's, there's no rules around it. You can fly it almost anywhere. Whereas the bigger drones, still have quite a few CASA regulations around them.
Smaller, quieter, more invisible, exactly
yeah.
What we want. Thanks, Nick. Tim, what Nick's just described about the way what happens around an image once it gets out into the sort of media system is really important. So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about your research and what you do and how images circulate online and these challenges of verification and disinformation and so on.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm a computational social scientist. So my work largely involves looking at large-scale data sets on social media and the web. And I use, big data computational methods primarily to understand information. And it just so happens that, the world that we live in now with the events we've had over the last few years has meant that, unfortunately, crisis events, emergency events and war and things like that have, made this sort of an ongoing issue. As far as, what's the entry point to talking about images in the media? I think from my perspective, I see that there's a frictionlessness to the way that images are shared nowadays. We're bombarded with imagery day and night. And I think that there's some really interesting shifts that I've noticed occurring over the last 5 or 10 years, but really, especially during the pandemic and during the Ukraine war, the proliferation of images that are coming from citizens and from open source intelligence sources, which I think, as far as I can see, that the biggest issue that we've got here is it's reconfigured what it means to trust and to have authority to represent what is happening, particularly for crisis events. And I think the points you're making, Nick, really resonated around context. And to me, that's one of the biggest issues that we're facing for verification in journalism, is that you can have real images like this kangaroo, and they're heartbreaking, some of the stuff that we see, but it's not doctored, it's not false, it's not manipulated. But the context is everything. And unfortunately, as you mentioned, you were bombarded by people who are upset because they didn't see. You can handle it, but I think to me this is I guess I'll close my point here by just highlighting this really key shift in dynamics that we see in verification, where we're bombarded by so many images that are coming, not only from professional, nationally significant photographers, but from drones that people are putting in the air above crisis events, emergency events, from smartphones that people just have in their pockets. And you see that there's this, the way that we produce the truth about things, the way that we verify and come to know things, is this real kind of networked dynamic. And it just reminds me of, there's one anecdote, I think. I don't want to sort of preface the Ukraine war stuff too quickly. Let's not jump into that. But I was really not amused, but I was really interested in late April. There was a situation where a Russian officer's barracks was hit by 3 HIMARS missiles. And the way that we found out about this was because a Russian officer was on top of the building, had videoed it on his smartphone, had uploaded the videos to Telegram, and then a Twitter account called Geolocator on Twitter had located, like verified that it was actually happening where it was, and that it was likely that this was happening. And then a NAFO fella, like a pseudonymous Twitter account named Blinska, with no profile details or anything like that, did the work of geo coordinating the videos. And that's how we came to know it. Then it was launched into the news media. And so this is the sort of process that we see happening, where we're sort of trying to understand and verify what's happening, but we're trying to bring context in from all angles. And it really is a very, very different scenario now than it was in a sort of more traditional modernist understanding of what journalism looks like. So yeah, it's, from my perspective, these are the things that I'm seeing and kind of grappling with.
A journalism is done by a journalist, whether it's good journalism or bad journalism. It's just a different form of information, just to be a twat.
I like that. Yeah, let's be twats.
Olga, this is a good segue, I think, to your work, which is looked at the ways that these kinds of technologies also enable new kinds of participation within warfare, understood very broadly. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. And I've got an image that you asked us to show here too.
Thanks, Michael. So the idea of participative war is that anyone with a device, with an internet-connected device, be it smartphone, a laptop, a drone, can participate and sort of collectively influence the conduct and the outcome of wars. And that agency of users to do things around the information in wars, to do things on the battlefield itself, that represents a fundamental shift from in the kind of military doctrine, if you will, because it used to be that the military were always interested in total control of the information, that what happens on the battlefield. That was for a very long time the way that the military functioned, whereas now it has shifted towards exerting influence over the information about the war. And because of that, just like Tim said, so many users they participate in documenting wars, and there's a myriad of ways in which users can do that. So they can broadcast things from the battlefront. They can offer their cultural commentary surrounding war. They can engage in cultural, creative, different kinds of production like memes or videos. They can witness other users experiencing war from afar. Open source intelligence, of course, is a large part of it. And also as a result, that opens the spaces for the misinformation, disinformation, and various actors trying to manipulate what the representation of wars looks like on the user end. And so I just wanted to touch base on a few points. One very significant one is that witnessing is never neutral. So witnessing wartime events always has consequences. And we saw the Russian soldier, right, filming some of their barracks and how that perspired and how that ended for them. There was also in the war in Ukraine, we are seeing a lot of the kind of opposite sides of witnessing, where witnessing the enemy is an act that can be used against the enemy. One never witnesses their own army vehicles. One never talks about their own army's movements when they witness them. And as we saw on TikTok, there has been a lot of the war in Ukraine represented on TikTok, and sometimes it turned fatal for the soldiers. So Ramzan Kadyrov's soldiers who were broadcasting, who were famous for their TikToks, they actually got hit in the process of filming a live TikTok at the battlefront. So witnessing is never neutral. And the other aspect is that the platforms have a responsibility to protect users from violent content, that they do, but it's often at odds and in tension with the civic responsibility of users to stay informed. And so this is an artwork by a Ukrainian artist, Vitaly Shuplak. It was just unveiled in Berlin last week. And I thought it really captures the experience of living through wartime events and trying to document your experiences of living through wartime events. Whereas a lot of the times platforms might label these experiences as sensitive content. And so it says it can be you. Sometimes platforms might consider your life to be too sensitive for visibility. And so this is just something, because since February 2022, platforms have removed over 100,000 videos and images that could have potentially been used not only in open source investigation, but also to prosecute war crimes perpetrated by Russia in Ukraine. And so a lot of these videos are permanently deleted. And so that just raises a question about the responsibility of the platforms, because since they are now these custodians of this digital archive that documents our understanding, our representation of war, it raises questions about their moral, legal, normative, procedural responsibilities to keep that user-generated archive safe, because otherwise we will end up having a very fragmented and distorted picture of what wars look like.
I mean, they own, when you upload, they own it. And whatever country they're in, all those things would be considered a crime, as in some of its evidence. So I can't understand why they could legally delete them anyway. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So in Ukraine, we've seen a bunch of sort of trends intensify. So the video you're watching now is a kind of prime example. So shot by the Ukrainian armed forces, it shows video recorded from a consumer off-the-shelf drone. We see a mortar drop directly into a tank. Likely, we're also seeing soldiers die or be severely wounded inside. This video, the YouTube version, has been viewed over 5 million times, but there are also many like it all over YouTube or Twitter and other social media. So videos like this show how the aerial view of war, which was once something that was sort of highly controlled by militaries, has become part of the sort of participatory field of media of war, as well as something that photojournalists and others can access as well. But videos like this are also difficult to interpret and difficult to contextualize. So Olga, can you tell us a little bit about this? Like, who releases an image like this and why do they release it?
Yes, so we've seen a proliferating amount of these images, these particular videos, and usually these are released by the Ukrainian armed forces or by different volunteering organizations that supply logistic, that manage logistical supply chains to the battlefront. And it's very interesting because this video conveys different messages to different audiences. So to Ukrainian citizens, it can convey that, hey, we got this, Ukrainian army is successful in repealing the Russian invasion, it's making progress in fighting the enemy. It's also a strong message to Ukraine's allies, seeing that a little bit goes a long way, and to kind of reaffirm the importance of supporting in a highly asymmetric military conflict, because let's be honest, the kind of gap between the capabilities that Russia has and that Ukraine has is enormous. It's still enormous. And yeah, and so that also might be an accountability or a transparency. It might be, this video might serve as a kind of a report. If a volunteer collects crowd-funded donations for a drone and then people chip in and they are able to purchase and deliver those drones to the battlefield, here's what the drones, like, here's what you paid for, here's the work that is being done in the battlefront by the drones. It is also furthermore a show of resilience and ingenuity, because in Russia's war against Ukraine, like nowhere before, we see the creative combinations of different kinds of media, repurposing of different media that we traditionally conceive of as civilian, such as drones, such as Starlink terminals, such as Steam decks. Also, Ukrainian soldiers now apparently use Steam decks to move the turrets, to kind of not put the soldiers at risk of being shot by the enemy. So there is a lot of that malleability, that kind of transition from the kind of off-the-shelf civilian technology into the military realm and straight into the battlefield, which I don't believe any other well-established armies of the world can actually allow to happen. And so that raises attention to the civilian military, the flow of civilian technologies into the military realm, but also to some of the military origins of the civilian technologies, such as the internet. So that it's not a very thick boundary, and there's objects fluctuating there and back. It tells us that in contemporary wars, any technology could potentially be used as a weapon. So it can be weaponized against the users who use it, like think cyber attacks, or it can be deployed against the enemy. So there have been a lot of interesting initiatives to, for example, facilitate a distributed denial of service attacks on Russian government servers, and that is done in the form of a game. So these things work both ways. It can be weaponized against the users, against the enemy, but this potential for weaponization is something that's really significant, and that's there to stay. Just one more comment. I've seen some journalists refer to this footage as a PlayStation warfare. And it is very easy to kind of adopt that disembodied perspective and sort of be observing these events from above. And I think these catch-in metaphors can be extremely harmful because at the end of the day, these images do serve to remind us that Ukrainian lives are still at stake in this war, and this thing could have caused real human casualties, multiple, if it hadn't been stopped. So just to kind of bring us back to the ground, sort of in this view from above. And yeah, thanks.
And exactly that metaphor has been a big part of the war on terror as well, and no one actually involved in doing it will really subscribe to that idea themselves in terms of their experience. Nick, so this video we've just seen isn't produced by journalists, and it was, as Olga pointed out, reported on extensively, as are others like it. So, you know, when you're looking at this as a photojournalist yourself, like what questions does imagery like this raise?
Well, I mean, instinctively, the very first sort of knee-jerk reaction is, yeah, it's like down the barrel, like photos or something, looking down the barrel of a gun or something. However, I mean, photojournalists have always been essentially on the front lines with their soldiers, as in they're always telling the perspective of their people anyway. It's even when, you know, it's like Australian photojournalists went over and covered Australian soldiers. Americans went over. Every now and then there might be a little bit the other way. There were very few that went over to cover the North Vietnamese in the Vietnam War. So, I mean, for me, it's more, I don't know, been there, done that, seen that. I mean, as in I've seen the imagery before. I mean, the first time we were sort of seeing this sort of stuff was probably the first Gulf War, when we're seeing the first JDAM bombs and stuff like that. And it's sort of like, well, what I find interesting is it's coming from such a tiny platform and such a cheap platform. So for me, it's more looking at actually what's going on here. You've got something that's like about $3,000 taking out something that's worth $500,000, and people as well. And I mean, it's just kind of learning how to analyze this sort of stuff. Like, you know, my picture of it's one kangaroo. When was it taken? You know, for me, it's not new for me. It's more about how these images are being acquired and how cheaply, you know, and it'll probably be soon that you won't even have people actually controlling them. They will be fully AI as in controlled out there.
Already partway there.
Yeah.
I mean, so for people who are not familiar with this example, in the 1991 Gulf War, you know, America sort of famously used satellite imagery for the first time to sort of demonstrate the scale of the conflict and their technological superiority. And this like top-down view of warfare became popularized through cable television. So we see the rise of cable news alongside this transformation of the visual field through these new satellite imagery and stuff. And so now we're getting the democratization in a way of this type of imagery where it's much easier and cheaper to produce, but the picture itself might not be so different.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, the concern is about the juvenile thing about cheering about people being killed. If like, especially if you've got no real, if you're not, I can understand it if you're Ukrainian or Latvian or some like where you've really got something skin in the game. But that's kind of also always been there. You know, there's always been that sort of that attitude, particularly amongst young men. So that's not really anything new. It's just new ways of getting it so really quickly. I mean, there's been plenty of footage from World War II of, you know, mass carpet bombing, nuclear weapons being used. We just didn't get it straight away. But there was always from our point of, you know, your point of view.
So Tim, zooming out from this example a bit, can you tell us about your findings on how the war in Ukraine has been manipulated? Tim has some extremely hot charts to show what he's going to put those up now.
Just get them up there.
Get them up there.
Should I stand up so I can look at these things?
Sure.
Yep. All right. Can I break rank? Yeah, we'll all look at it. So I think, I mean, where am I going to stand awkwardly? I think Olga made a really interesting point about the weaponization of technology. And I think this is kind of a good segue to these hot charts that you're seeing here. So among the different technologies that are being weaponized, here talking specifically about Ukraine war in particular, is social media and in the information ecosystem. What you're looking at here is a chart that I generated about, I think it was around the end of March last year. So it was nearly a month after the war had started. And I'd been tracking about 300 Russian diplomatic and embassy accounts who were spreading various different kinds of war propaganda about trying to justify narratives about the invasion and various aspects relating to it. And the background was that I noticed something interesting about these accounts. The first thing is that they were working together. So even though there's embassies in different parts of the world, I mean, Australia's even got one. And if you go and have a look at the Twitter account in Australia, you'll see it's got some really conspiratorial takes on various different things, even today. But these accounts were working together as a kind of like giant war propaganda machine, pumping out these preferred narratives about the war, Nazis, NATO, nuclear bombs, you know, the same old things that we're trying to rehearse. Now, something that was really interesting to me was that when I went and visited the profiles of these accounts and looked at the tweets that they were sending out, there was a whole bunch of accounts that were liking and retweeting this stuff. And so one has to ask, okay, this is obviously a contested digital space, but who or what is in support of this invasion? What's going on? And as I went more and more into this in a deep sort of qualitative way, I noticed that so many of these accounts had all of the hallmark characteristics of kind of being fake accounts, you know, that they were clearly created recently, had in a hasty kind of way, were purpose-built. All they were doing was going on to the tweets that were coming out from, like, you know, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or different embassies all over the world. Name weird countries you never heard of before. They got an embassy there. They're pumping out propaganda. And so this is me giving the background, the context, if you like, to this chart. This chart shows the number of Twitter accounts that were created on each day since the 1st of January 2021 until the 22nd of March. Remember, the war, this invasion began on the 24th of February, just about a month later. And it would be funny if it weren't so serious. That all of the accounts that I was tracking in this data set had liked these embassy tweets at least 5 times. So, you know, they like Russia. They like what's happening. And you can see here on the chart that there's this kind of ramping up of accounts. And when you get to the day when that peak right there is literally the day that Russia invaded, and there is an absolute army of fake accounts that had been created and consistently created with a single purpose: to amplify and push these narratives so that Russia can game the algorithms and get visibility for these preferred takes, for this perception of what is happening in Ukraine. And so the second image, the second hot chart, even hotter in many ways. This one is, in a sick way, even more hilarious. So what I did is I thought, okay, everyone talks about, you know, bots, so automated accounts that they're not people. I mean, do I really need to explain what a bot is? It's 2023 and we're here. Yeah, so this kind of thing. And look, we can go into all sorts of debates about bots and things like this, but there are tools, state-of-the-art, rigorous tool, AI-based tools that can be used to get a pretty clear signal on whether or not a given Twitter account is likely to be automatically controlled or not. Now, what I did, see, this hot chart is already becoming boring in the telling. But what I did was it took a long time. So I had to, you know, back when Twitter actually had an API and you could do a lot of this work. Thank you to the person. Thank you for that. Yeah, commiserations. We could slowly but surely go through and start to track and run, you know, this botometer tool, which is run out of Indiana University, on each of these accounts and just ask, you know, give us a score between 0 and 1. 0 is extremely likely to be human. 1 is extremely likely that this is a completely automated account. And so, you know, this chart looks pretty standard over here, you know, just another day in paradise kind of thing. You've got a nice distribution of accounts. These are the number of accounts that have a given bot score. Remember, like, human is down here and sort of more automated is up here. Remember, these are fake-ish looking accounts, so they're going to have a pretty high bot score. But what really got me was this guy over here, this little finger that's shooting into the air. This is about 700 or so Twitter accounts that have a perfect bot score. 700. That's yeah. And so that, yeah. So what I guess what I'm trying to get at is that there is overwhelming evidence that pro-Russian actors, let's be precise in our terminology, pro-Russian actors burned an insane amount of resources trying very early on in the war to change people's perceptions, to change the public's perceptions. They did so through gaming and weaponizing the information space. Twitter, this is only Twitter. Twitter may not be around for very long with the way that things are going, but I still think that this is it's really critical, because Twitter, in my estimation, it might be a small little platform comparatively, but all roads lead to and from Twitter. Journalists are there, politicians are there, opinion leaders are there. And so on Twitter doesn't stay on Twitter. So this is a really, the work that I did was really worrying, because it's still unclear to what extent you know, this had an impact on how long we're not going to be able to hold war crimes to account, to be able to reconcile what actually is happening, and so on. Yeah.
Thanks, Tim. What I'd like to do is kind of get into a bit more of a bit more of a more complicated event than the video that we just saw, which is the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam in Russian-held territory of Ukraine a little over a month ago on 6th of June 2023. So the explosion of the dam caused massive flooding, thousands of people evacuated, dozens of people killed and many more missing and wounded, all of which is, of course, truly terrible. But for our purposes, one of the things that's interesting about this event is the way the imagery has been generated. So as you can see from the videos on the screen, there's a lot of drone footage being produced here, and I'm going to ask Nick in a sec to talk a little bit about like where this might have come from. But also the imagery is being, this is all from a New York Times story, by the way, and the images are all credited to the AP. So there's some verification has gone on, but they're also being overlaid with computer graphics using techniques to sort of try and show us what the change is that's taken place. All of which kind of point to the interaction of increasing techniques of modeling and, if not pure automation, then the application of computer technology over the top of the sort of imagery that we're familiar with. So Nick, if you want to say a little bit about these images and perhaps about what it would be like to, the challenges of reporting on something like this.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've done plenty of floods. I mean, the first things that come up into my mind, because the dam was in Russian controlled territory, was kind of like, oh, I wonder where they got it from. But drones can be zipped in and out fairly easily these days. As far as, had the fantastic layout, I mean, loads of paper, everybody goes, oh, bloody New York Times. They seem to be the only ones who actually have the money to do any of this funky, cool stuff, because they're paying all our exorbitant wages and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, look, as a photojournalist on the ground in floods are actually harder and, in my opinion, more dangerous than fires and a lot of other things. You've got loads of, apart from the actual, you can't see where you're walking, you can fall into holes, you get ulcers and insect bites, and then you got mosquito infections and all sorts of horrible stuff. But I mean, a lot of the pictures that did come out of it further downstream were actually more traditional sort of photojournalism you'd see from a natural disaster. Yeah, I guess that's all I'd kind of say out of it. It was more just like interesting, talk about doubling down on difficult events, a natural disaster in a war zone. Actually, it was vaguely reminiscent of, in 2004, I covered the Asian tsunami in Banda Aceh, which was wasn't as much fought over as this, of course, but there was a lot of, gunfire going on in the Aceh province when the tsunami hit. And so that everybody sort of made friends after that one. Anyway.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's interesting that you pointed out is that, like, drone technologies, for instance, here enable a vision of something that would be really hard, right, if you were stuck on the ground or particularly held out of the region for various forms of safety.
Drones have completely opened up. You just couldn't get there before. Yeah. And the access to helicopters is almost unheard of. In fact, you couldn't. Down.
Yeah.
Fire's a bit different because the fire authorities are usually bombing, water bombing stuff. They don't want drones up in the air. So there may be some movement in that area, but at this stage, it's sort of restricted.
Yeah. Thanks, Nick. So Olga, with an event like this, the Kakhovka Dam explosion opens up a kind of space for understanding these sort of significant wartime events. And I'm just curious about what the role of like citizen participation or open source investigation and so on play in this. And I've got some pictures up here from you as well.
Yeah, so to me, the Kakhovka Dam explosion was a drastic example of the ways in which analytical tools and processes that are used to create knowledge in Western societies can be used to undermine or obfuscate the actual wartime developments. And so if you remember these early days after we kind of saw all the ideas of objectivity, balance in news coverage get misappropriated by Russia to create confusion, to sow doubt as to what had actually happened. And so even this investigation by the New York Times, right, they spent a whole week debating the whodunit debate was, and the headlines read something like, Russia and Ukraine both accuse each other of blowing up the Kakhovka Dam, whereas there were no international organizations present on the spot to deliver aid. There were a lot of people who had drowned. There were a lot of people who were not able to get evacuated. So this just shows that sometimes when it's impossible to verify an event or an image, sometimes there's a reason for it. And sometimes there are forces that can be actively preventing, through blackouts, through the destruction of critical communication infrastructure, if it's not possible to get there otherwise, just preventing this verification. And so, yes, open source investigation has been extremely helpful in finding the cause, but really, I wish we were talking more about the outcomes. So that was my initial reaction when that happened. And now we're seeing the very same rhetoric surrounding the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. There are multiple articles saying Ukraine and Russia accuse each other of planning to blow up the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, and that is so we're seeing the same process repeated over and over again. And so in this context, some ways of seeing news are more helpful in understanding these events, even if symbolically. So this photo on the right was taken by my fellow Fulbrighter, Sergei Koroviny, kind of like Nick's photo. It does symbolize the tragedy that was unfolding in Kherson and Kherson region by rescuing this dog that was drowning. And so I do think that sometimes some of these perspectives, they're not representative, but they actually kind of frame the conversation in a way that is productive and in a way that generates the appropriate response among those who witness it.
Thanks, Olga. Tim, I just wanted, if you could say a little bit about how an event like this does get kind of contested online. So New York Times, for example, prevaricating is something we know is typical of news media, but what happens in online spaces?
Well, I mean, it depends which online space you're talking about. I think that the interesting thing about images and video is that they're always drawn like pinballs or resources into contested narratives about what's happening. And I think, Olga's point about knowledge production is kind of critical here, because what we see is that on platforms like Twitter, you have contestation. It's a contested digital space. You have pro-Russian actors and you have everyone else trying to make sense of imagery and things like that. But the differences that we see is that I think on some platforms like Telegram, you see that there's this lack of contestation where, for example, the same image that is shared or the same video that shows the same drone perspective of the dam will be used as a resource to support Russia or the Kremlin's perspective that it was detonated by Ukrainians. The exact same image will be circulated, in other areas or by news media, and context again is everything, where the narrative that's put around this, where the empiricism that's attached to that image tells us is a completely different way of knowing. It tells us a different perspective that about what happened. And so what's at stake, I think, with images and with these images that we've had in particular, is what's at stake is truth. I mean, again, we come back to what's at stake is what is actually happening here. And I think, yeah, that just to wrap it up, I think that, the key thing that we see is that some spaces online are more amenable to weaponization of images and videos for disinformation purposes, where the idea is not to build consensus like the New York Times piece was trying to do, and all of the other actors that are involved, engineers and non-profit agencies that are trying to use these images and these videos, triangulate them. They're trying to understand what's really happening. And on other platforms, you see that what's trying to happen is you just slap a big fake label over the top of Associated Press images of the dam. And that is exactly what is happening. And so I think this is, again, I come back to this context. I think this is really kind of critical to, at least from a disinformation kind of perspective.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I'm conscious that we're getting sort of towards time where it'd be great to get some input from the audience. So I'll just note that we'll use Slido as we've done through the event, but so if you have a question or anything you want to pop in there, please do that. It's hard to run a mic around this room in particular, and that way it'll the question will get captured by the recording. So we're in LT 106 if you want to add any questions to the Slido. You know, in the interest of making sure we do have time, like I'll do one more quick question for each of you, and then maybe try and keep them brief, so that we've got time to talk a bit further. One word answers, no context, decontextualize everything. Tim, I'll stay with you and sort of and then ask you, well, given the kind of problems that you've just laid out, what do researchers do? What tools and methods do they need? And what have you been doing in that space?
I'll keep it really short. I think we need to work together. I think what we really need is like collaborative sharing of knowledge so that we can do collective sense making using a whole bunch of different methods and approaches. You know, the particular angle I bring in is computational methods using data science approaches to look at the 30,000 foot level and then zooming right into the very, very nitty gritty of individual accounts. But I think, yeah, that would be my kind of little takeaway is it's like, let's talk, let's share resources and try and, you know, work together so that people who don't have as many digital skills can be skilled up in that area, and those that need more sort of domain expertise skills or domain understanding can be facilitated. Because I think you really can't get to the bottom of things unless you can't really tackle this as a kind of detective, if you like, if you don't have access to a range of different tools. Yeah.
Thanks. Perfect. Olga, just to complicate matters more, we've got a lot of talk at this symposium, but of course across the world about generative AI and its impact. So I was wondering what your thoughts were on that when we're in these sort of contested spaces that we've been talking about, where any kind of knowledge claim can become very complicated very quickly.
Yeah, just a quick point to what Tim had said. So we have NAFO in the background, and that actually is an example of a process of collective sense making and online collective that is trying to spread information and kind of raise awareness about that. So it's interesting that we empirically can witness these instances of activism that we thought were more of a relic of, that we couldn't find before. With regard to ChatGPT and generative AI in particular, as news gets more automated and as more generative large language models are used to summarize different things, I just ran a little experiment and I asked ChatGPT, why did Russia attack Ukraine? And I just want to read the answer for you all. I do with a caveat that, of course, ChatGPT ends in 2021, but since Russia had first attacked Ukraine in 2014 and had been attacking it ever since, it's still a very relevant question. So I quote, "The conflict between Russia and Ukraine is a complex and multifaceted issue with multiple factors at play. The specific motivations and justifications for Russia's actions are subject to debate and interpretation. It is important to know that different parties involved may have different perspectives on the matter." So there you go. That's a short summary of why, of the invasion. Thank you.
Thanks, Olga. Nick, we'll just finish with you, and I mean, it's a huge question in some ways, and this is one of Nick's incredible photos of the Black Summer bushfires, I think, right?
Yep.
It's like, how do newsrooms deal with all of this? Like, what does it mean when you're actually trying to?
Well, the newsrooms just sit in their butts at the office and don't do anything. It's photographers who are out there working their butts off. Look, it's interesting. In some ways, it's the same old story. You still need to be there if you are going to, the challenge that we're getting at the moment is there's more and more second, third hand reporting getting into the newspapers. So it's a reporter interviewing somebody who may have heard something, or, whereas reportage is about witnessing it yourself as a specialist and an expert. And so Black Summer bushfires were very much about that for me. I mean, this particular incident was myself, a few firefighters and a couple of other photographers were actually it was the Green Wattle Creek fire. It was moving, jumped across Warragamba Dam and was moving in towards outer western suburbs, and then really out of the blue, it just literally exploded, and we had to, I wouldn't say run for our lives, but run for our hair because it was getting all singed off and cooked off. But at this stage, it's still, I mean, you can put cameras on trucks and things like that, but it's still very manual as far as capturing this sort of stuff. You have to be able to grab the scientific knowledge, your experience, and anticipate what's about to happen to get images like this. I do have a few ideas on making things more automated though, and one of those is I've been chatting with the RFS and a couple of other groups about essentially nailing in fireproofed cameras that are on a Wi-Fi or a phone link and surrounding a fire, and so that when the fire moves through, not only are you getting wind and scientific data, but they're getting a live feed to the RFS about what this fire is doing, particularly when it actually sweeps over. There's some super cool footage to get there, but also it'll be valuable sort of data. So it's that sort of stuff where a little bit of funding. In some ways, it's kind of similar to like using the drones. It's actually small amount of funding can actually have big results. It's just, somebody give me some cash.
Academics everywhere also asking this.
Yeah.
Thanks, Nick. And I think like Nick's point about second and third hand information moving into reportage is also true of second and third hand imagery and computer generated imagery now and so on, which adds this additional difficulty in the practical level for newsrooms and so on. So a bunch of different questions. I doubt we're going to get through them all, but we'll give it a shot. So
point out that one of the legends of photojournalism in Australia is actually photographing us at the moment, Michael Amendolia, who was a celebrated photojournalist when I began, even though he looks younger than me now. Yeah.
Double act, and we didn't know. Okay, so first question's from Fan Yang, and it's a general question to the panel. So are we experiencing a shift towards individualization of weapons and weaponization of individual devices? And is there a kind of political ecology or economy behind this kind of shift? So I guess the question is getting at are people being targeted at an individual level, and is like weaponry in the way that we saw perhaps too targeting individuals? So I'll let anyone who would like to jump in on that and just a shift towards individualization of weapons and weaponization of individual devices. Actual weapons? Yeah, right. Yeah, individual targeting. Yeah. On the as the military tech guy, I guess, at up the front here, and Olga may have something to say about this as well. I mean, absolutely, this is the kind of tendency of a lot of that type of technology, is the idea of a precision of picking out an individual person. Whether that is actually what happens in practice is very variable, and whether that's what we have seen in conflicts that the counterterrorism wars of the United States in Afghanistan or Pakistan or Iraq, where they've been used in a kind of individually targeted way, whether at a known person or what appears to be a threat. But in Ukraine and perhaps in future conflicts where the balance of martial power, like a force, is more similar, we might see that individual dimension kind of dropping away, because it's maybe something that is possible in certain domains, like what we just saw with the tank, but might not be possible with like two very large armies facing each other in a theatre of war. But maybe the question about individual devices is something that that Olga or Tim has thoughts about.
Yes, I do agree there is that. I think it's a great question. I do think that there's a lot of points at which individuals can be made vulnerable to different weaponization, for example, cyber attacks, or even thinking of the recent data leaks that we had in Australia, such as the Medibank data leak that was perpetrated by Russian affiliated hackers. So there is an increasing use of that in the interests of the military and strategic interests. But also, I'm also witnessing an increasing collectivization, people really getting together in ways that probably we haven't conceived of in our sort of more digital era or digital realm, where it is highly individualized. There are emerging forms of sociality, of collective, that are achieving their collectively established goals, be it crowdfunding, be it through. So sometimes people do use platforms to come together and act in a concerted way to achieve a certain objective, and we're seeing that as well. So it's both, I guess.
Oh, yeah, I mean, I don't have a lot to add here. I think maybe it'd be, like, I'd be keen to have a conversation later on, but I think it's a really good question. And as far as social media is concerned, yes, I mean, we see a continuation of targeting of individuals. There are continuities from what we saw with like the active measures in sort of Soviet era disinformation, targeting key individuals, whether to try and co-opt them or to get them to sympathize with you. These days, if you can get like Cardi B or someone to tweet, hey, something like the chat GPT, you know, like, hey, maybe it's a complex and multifaceted issue, that's payday, right? So a lot of, for the invaders it is. And so I think, yeah, there is a conversation to be had about individualization of targets and the weaponization of of online capital. That's definitely something, but it plays out totally differently. When you talk about Ukraine, we talk about every different country, different contexts. There's not one size fits all, but I think, yeah, you're really onto something there.
We're bang on 3:15, but we've got a break, and I thought that since we started a few minutes late, we'll just take a couple more questions and then we'll wrap up. So a question about using drones, and from Mitch Price, and it's about the zooming function, and the sense that like it becomes difficult to see where it actually is in the picture, and so you know, there's a kind of view from nowhere effect there that's kind of interesting. I wondered if you had thoughts on that, on the.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually not even from drones. And I did this myself during the lockdown. People were accusing photographers of playing with their long lens, having people on the beaches, making it look like their beaches were fuller than they were. It's like, yeah, we'll deal with it. You know, yes, that happens. You don't go to the beach, you know, it's COVID lockdown, just be cool. So yeah, look, most of these small drones don't really have that feature, except for the very new ones. Some of that stuff that you're seeing is actually digitally zoomed in. So I guess you are losing context. And I mean, everybody does that. You have to keep that in mind, that sometimes it might be just to make it a bit easier to see, but yeah, you are losing information. It's always trying to get best to get it from the original source if you can. That's you know, yeah, it's always best to have the raw data. Yep, it is. There's zooms coming in, and they're going to get more and more powerful and better. And I mean, they aren't really even images anyway. I mean, the photos that you see on your phone, they're not photos really. There's so much software going on in there. There's scans with a kind of like a mishmash of video and stills, to the point where it's not really reality. It's kind of an interpretation. I'm actually considering for some events actually going back to film, so I can actually go or at least have a film analog thing of it, so I can argue I'm not a liar, I'm telling the truth. Just so as a bit of a,
I mean, yeah, I mean, every photo that we take almost today is an incredibly automated action and product, right? Like loaded with metadata and all sorts of stuff, which can be stripped away or manipulated or whatever, and all sorts of things happen to it.
Well, it's not even like this. It's kind of not even. It's like a software interpretation of what it's seeing rather than actual scan in a lot of ways. So it's kind of not even real anyway. So just
don't worry about it.
Yeah.
Really good question from Taranima about the professionalization of open source intelligence work, and maybe something that we've seen happen a little bit in Ukraine. I mean, open source intelligence in organizations like Bellingcat or forensic architecture in a different kind of vein have been around for a while, at least a sort of decade in their current form, but they seem to be becoming more and more professional. And she's just wondering about, like, does that professionalization create challenges for the sort of hacker ethos or the DIY, like from the ground up type approach that comes from that? Is that something you're seeing, Olga, in Ukraine, or is it something else?
It definitely has a DIY ethos. It has definitely become much more widespread and much more professionalized, and Bellingcat is now a household name whose analysis is being used to prosecute war crimes and in war crimes investigations. So this is a new thing again we're seeing, where it wasn't taken seriously by the legal system in any case for in the past wars, and we're seeing that it's increasingly becoming part of our knowledge production system. So it definitely is used. A lot of open source intelligence reports and analytics are used to frame wartime events, to attribute blame, to prosecute them. And so yes, I guess there is we are witnessing a certain professionalization, where it's going to lead, whether it's going to fall into the same trap of knowledge production manipulation, as it becomes more licensed and more kind of subject to various different kinds of tests and licenses and accreditations. We don't know, but we'll see what happens to it in 10 years.
Thank you. I will ask one more question, because I think it's a really good one to finish on, and just ask for a quick answer from whoever would like to hop in. And it's from Paul Henman, and it just asks, is collective sense making kind of now impossible in a media space in which things happen so fast that the velocity of media is just accelerated so much? Is it still possible to have collective sense making, or is that a project that's beyond us?
Yes, but just not right at that second. Just give it a few weeks, take it all in. I guess that's what we were talking about earlier on. It's like,
let it breathe.
Yeah.
Trust Paul Henman to be asking a question like this. I mean, Wikipedia is a great example of it's the least worst form of collective sense making, in my opinion. And it's a mainstay of contemporary knowledge production. So I'm going to be the mindlessly optimistic person in the room and say that I think there are things that I think are pushing us towards the ability to use technologies and to have them mediate our interactions with each other in a healthy, pro-informational kind of way. I do see that these things are happening. And hey, I'll make one last point. Twitter's community notes, like, get onto that. Twitter, we could talk about how bad it is all day long, and we'll talk about it later on, but I think this community notes is such an interesting and worthwhile model, and it's fresh and new. So my opinion is, I think we can do it.
Optimism is a good note to go for coffee on. So thank you all for coming. Thank you to the panel. And thank you too for all the organizers and all the support staff who've been doing an amazing job throughout the last 2 days. Greatly appreciated, I'm sure, by everybody involved in the event. Thanks a lot.